If you could have full control over a story and change how it was told, which story would you pick and why? This is a question which can have multiple answers for each person. In fact, some people might have a list of stories or shows they desperately want to remake, whether it's an amazing show with all of the right things, but at least one or two imperfect things, or a collection of dumpster fire flaws that they love to hate because the writer always got so close to telling something worthwhile. In this video, it's not really bad stories that I would like to salvage or rewrite, although there are some. A lot of them are stories which I greatly enjoy, but which I know I would enjoy even more if they had been written to better fit my tastes. We've all had that moment where the show or story we really enjoy has that boring arc which drags its feet, or that one really annoying character who ruins every scene they touch. There are also plenty of stories where there's only one thing wrong with it, and we can still greatly enjoy the story, but that one wrong thing is almost always coming back and reminding you that it exists. The story would not change much if that one thing was removed, but for some reason, the writers just can't stop bringing it up. It's always returning, again and again and again. Much like the first sponsor that I ever had on this channel, Aura. I want you guys to think about a time when a company you trusted announced a data breach involving your personal information. What went through your mind as you processed the news? What actions did you take to respond? And most importantly, what actions did you not take to respond? Because not responding or taking any action in this moment right now could leave you vulnerable to future data breaches. After all, hackers may have stolen the social security numbers of every American. So if you live in America like I do, you might want to listen to what I have to say. Over 2.9 billion records were stolen from National Public Data, which offers personal information to employers, private investigators, staffing agencies, and others doing background checks. These stolen records include a person's full name, address, date of birth, social security number, and phone number, along with alternate names and birth dates. And members of the hacker group have reportedly released this information for free online. I don't know about you guys, but as a person who has had their passwords stolen in the past, that sort of thing is incredibly terrifying to me. Oftentimes we think it can't happen to us until it does, and we're left without any idea of what to do or who to call. Even if you're doing your best to keep your identity safe, things like this can still happen. And by the time you realize it has happened, it'll already be too late. That's why it's so important to get ahead of it and prepare for the worst. If you weren't taking precautions with your personal information online before, this should be a huge wake-up call. You've never been more vulnerable online than you are right now. But for me personally, I'm not too worried because I use Aura. Aura alerts me if my phone number, email, or social security number is on the dark web. They're going to let me know fast if anyone tries to use this information to get access to my credit or bank accounts. They also give me up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario ever happen to me again. There's also a ton of other features to keep you safe online, all inside one easy-to-use app. You can go to my link, aura.com/scrit, to try 14 days for free. That will be enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data has been exposed. I highly recommend you do this right now because not only is National Public Data not going to do anything to help you, they're probably not going to face any repercussions for this leak. And if there aren't any repercussions, that more than likely means it's going to happen again. I'm not leaving myself vulnerable to data breaches, and if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/scrit and try 2 weeks for free. Anyways, back to the rest of the video. I want to section this video off into several different categories for the types of stories I desperately want to rewrite. I feel there are different stories which I would rewrite for different reasons, and some of them I wouldn't really be doing as much rewriting as I would just be taking out the glaring flaws which don't really need to exist and serve the narrative no purpose whatsoever. Speaking of which, I think we should start with those because those are the types of stories I would personally change the least. Call of the Night, Mushoku Tensei, Made in Abyss, Dan Da Dan. They all have one glaring flaw in common, and if you've watched any of those, I think you know what it is. But for those of you who haven't, they have a weird relationship with underage characters. some to far greater degrees than others, but all of them to some sort of gradient. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the shared flaw between all of these shows because I think it's obvious for anyone who has watched them, and because I want this video to be monetized. So instead, I think I'll briefly talk about why I enjoy each show and why those things would be untouched simply by aging the characters up to adults. Call of the Night is a story about a boy with insomnia who sneaks out of his apartment at night to walk the streets alone. He's aimless, not knowing what he should do for the rest of his life, since school was never that interesting for him, and the idea of working in an office is just not appealing at all. That's when he meets his love interest, who shows him all of the unique and interesting things about becoming a vampire and walking the night. The reason I like this story so much is simply because the vibes are immaculate. The romance could be cute, and I emphasize could be, because there's just one small yet glaring flaw with this show. And it's the fact that this main character is 14! Why is he 14, you might ask? Just because. That's why. Call of the Night is a show which could basically be written the exact same way, except about someone who is freshly graduated from high school, a fully grown 18-year-old adult, and someone struggling with the exact same existential crisis. After all, when we graduate high school, many of us are told that college is the next step. Either that, or you get a job. There's an expectation that when we're 18, we're meant to go out into the world and find ourselves, to slowly learn and grow into who we are going to be for the rest of our lives. It's a period in our lifetimes which is greatly uncertain. There's a lot of important decisions and self-discovery to be made. When I was 14, I was doing absolutely fucking none of these things. And I don't even know why the show is trying to pretend that a 14-year-old should reasonably be struggling with these existential crises. I mean, maybe we can argue that Japan is culturally different and they expect more from their young people than they do in America or other Western countries, but still, I'm nearly twice this fucker's age, and I can safely tell him he's got a long way to go before he starts making any permanent decisions about his life. Matter of fact, where are his damn parents? Little bro, just go home. Come back when the police don't have to chase you down for breaking a curfew. And then maybe you can have a romance with a 40-year-old vampire cougar who isn't a weird, problematic relationship for you.
Wait, what?
Yeah, no, actually 30 years this Monday.
So you're like 47.
No, I'm 17. I've just been 17 for 30 years.
The reason I love Mushoku Tensei is its world building, its premise, and the themes of someone making the most out of a second chance at life. Above all, though, Mushoku Tensei's premise of being reincarnated as a child in a magical fantasy world with all of your memories from your previous life is simply a premise that will never fail to hook me. Not only am I instantly thinking about what I would do if I were put in a situation like that, I'm also instantly invested to see what that person would do. Oh, god damn it. I started reading Mushoku Tensei as a manga when I was in high school, and when I rewatch and reread the story as an adult, I feel as though I am constantly and unendingly haunted by the ghost of Rudius's everything. There's so much to like about Mushoku Tensei. In fact, you can forget about its flaws quite often in the show. I mean, sure, he's got the mind of a middle-aged man, and the point of his character is to show how a complete loser like him can grow and change for the better as he lives his new life. However, can we all admit that his relationships with girls who are his age in the show are still very weird? It's one of those strange situations where there's a moral gray area which more often than not leans towards just being terrible the more you think about it, but which can also just kind of be ignored or somewhat justified. We can see that it's not always meant to be titillation and that Rudy actually does form a genuine emotional connection with these girls, but then the story kind of grinds to a halt and drags its feet during some of the arcs and is a bit boring during the academia period, mainly because there's not really any sort of conflict which properly challenges Rudy. That does change after he goes to rescue his mother, which is a big step in the right direction as far as providing turmoil for the characters in the story, but I digress. Mushoku is one of those stories which probably shouldn't have a romance in it until the characters are all adults. But I don't know how much I can expect Japan to do something like that at this point. As a longtime anime fan, I've learned to just turn my brain off for those sorts of things. So the way I would change Mushoku Tensei would basically just to be remove most of the romance, titillation, and otherwise in the beginning arcs, or at the very least make it more certain that it is wrong. As for Dandadan and Made in Abyss, these are two shows on opposite sides of the same coin for me, or rather opposite ends of the same gradient that I described earlier, where one depicts sexual situations between underage characters in a relatively harmless, or at the very least, ignorable degree. The other is just flat out the author's not so thinly veiled fetish. I would go so far as to say, just don't watch Made in Abyss. The amazing world building and dark fantasy of the story is just not enough to counteract all the weird shit in that show. Especially if you're an adult who can read the subtext of each scene, and how the only characters who never seem to get any sort of horrible death conveniently share one thing in common with each other, and it's their relationship to children. Meanwhile, most of Dandadan's situations are either between minors or small moments that you can maybe ignore during the beginning of the show. It's a horny show, but it's got a lot to offer as well. I probably wouldn't even take all of that stuff out. I'd just veil it a little bit more. There's definitely a world where you can show these situations between people of the same age, because that's just something which is true to life. When you're a teenager, that's the age where you begin to discover those things. I just think that those things should be handled in a more mature way instead of a titillating or fetishistic manner. However, I also know that when I was in high school, I did not care about those things when I was watching High School DxD. So I know who the writers are trying to appeal to, and I'm just hoping it's not somebody my age. Made in Abyss, on the other hand, I definitely know who they're trying to appeal to, and it's disgusting. But as I talk about Made in Abyss, I'm reminded of a different category of story which I would also want to rewrite. And that's the type of story which is good in its concept and premise, but which always frustratingly falls short on its execution. For me, these are the Wistorias, the Solo Levelings, the JJKs, and the Danmachis of the world. They are shows which can get me invested enough to watch the whole thing, all the while hating every moment of it as the writer does everything they can to snatch a terrible story from the jaws of a great story. I'll start with JJK, because as much as I tend to rag on JJK on this channel, it's actually the least egregious of the others in this category, and that's because I can still remember a time when I loved JJK, and in fact, I do still think that there's a lot to like about it, even after everything. I can find myself enjoying the bones of this story. Heck, this script is currently being written while I blare a JJK AMV to the tune of Yeet. There are a lot of storytelling issues with JJK after the Shibuya arc, which is why I feel there are so many fans of the show at the moment. The Shibuya arc is the peak of JJK, and it is a slow and gradual decline before plummeting off a cliff. Most people, in order to justify their sunk cost, will often delude themselves into believing that the later arcs of JJK were actually amazing and the greatest, most cerebral storytelling of all time, and that you're just not smart enough to understand it like they do. And I can definitely see why people still like it, don't get me wrong. However, I feel that the one core problem JJK has is its pacing. It's all gas and no brakes. No time to actually sit down and appreciate any of the new characters that we're introduced to, or grow attached to them before they maybe die. All of the issues I have with JJK could be fixed if the writer just took a few more chapters and episodes to flesh out each arc as it happened. There's actually nothing wrong with JJK's storytelling when you look at it from a bird's eye view. Even the big events which split the fandom could have easily been resolved if the story was told in a different order or with a bit more setup before the reveals. The reason I dog on JJK so much is not because I think it's the worst anime ever. It's because it could have been one of the greatest, but it squandered its potential in an effort to end the story faster. I can tell that the writer didn't want to write JJK anymore. They just wanted to finish it. I was more in love with what I expected JJK to become than I was with what I actually got. Much of the chapters after the Shibuya arc are boring, info-dumping slop, which I have to read multiple times to fully untangle and parse. Either that, or it's just a bunch of flair without substance. If I had control of JJK's writing, all I would do is simply expand upon each arc following Shibuya, recognizing that this is a time of great change and turmoil for the story, and that I basically need to re-establish the story and the characters for the audience. I won't go into too much detail since I want to talk about the other flaws in this category, but just know that I have about a video's worth of ideas of how I would make JJK better in retrospect. And let's take a quick break to talk about exactly what I'm doing here in this video for anyone who might get offended by this exercise. I'm not trying to claim that I'm a better writer than any of the people who have made these stories. In fact, I want everyone watching this video to recognize that it is a lot easier to critique than it is to create. We all know the flaws we would change about a particular story once it's finished. That's because we have the benefit of hindsight. Sometimes when we write things, we can only really fully understand the quality of what we've written after it's been seen by the public. It's one of the reasons I decided to release the rough draft of my book for people who want to see it and criticize it. I also want to stress that many of these stories are made and released as just that, rough drafts. Even in America, many writers are under strict deadlines and do not have the ability to sit on their story for a few months before they have to release it. Edits need to be made in the moment as they are needed, and many poorly executed stories that we criticize are a product of simply not allowing the writers enough time to really flesh out their concepts. That being said, there is something to be criticized when the source material is actually just better than the adaptations. Danmachi and Solo Leveling are both apparently suffering from this issue. Both of them were originally light novels, and both of those light novels are apparently much better than their adaptations. Now, fair warning, I have not read the light novels of either of these stories, and I probably never will. What I do know, though, is that there are plenty of people in my comment sections who will swear by them and state that the adaptations remove a lot of the important details necessary for enjoying the story and the characters. And, they might be coping, or they could be right, but either way, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt here. It's not easy to adapt a book into a visual medium, and there's a lot of things which need to be considered when transferring to those mediums. The inner monologue of a character is something which cannot be fully replicated in a more visual medium like anime. The narrator's voice is an important part of any book, and it can really engross you in the story more than any other medium. Sometimes our imaginations are more powerful than any picture or video we can look at. Both Solo Leveling and Danmachi struggle with the same core issue, and it's that the only character who seems to matter in the story is the main character. Both stories start promisingly enough. We've got a really cool premise and concept, some nice power fantasy, and a genuinely immersive world setting that we can see ourselves living in. There's even a bit of mystery and intrigue to keep us curious and invested for future reveals down the road. Mysterious powers at work in RPG dungeons wherein heroes will slowly uncover as the story progresses. Powers beyond comprehension for which no one is prepared to face without the help of our protagonists. They've also got a big cast of characters who all have different powers, ranks, and things to contribute to the narrative, only for the writer to use absolutely none of those things and just have the main protagonist clean through everything while the rest of the characters cheer them on from the sidelines. Admittedly, though, DanMachi does this to a much lesser degree, and there are some characters who are relatively well built and important to the story of DanMachi. However, a lot of the conflict in DanMachi is subpar at best, and a lot of the motivations for each character just don't make a lot of sense. Adding on to that is the fact that interesting characters become less interesting over time as they lose their agency to become an NPC whose sole purpose is to glaze the protagonist. These stories are what I would like to categorize as stories which have several different small and minor yet very consistent issues, but whose issues all stem from a single core foundational flaw. JJK's core issue is its pacing. Solo Leveling and DanMachi's core issue is its lack of a supporting cast, which can stand on its own. And Wistoria's fatal flaw is that it trades genuinely good conflict for cheap power fantasy. And go figure, Wistoria was written by the same author as DanMachi. So it has a lot of very cool and strong concepts with some pretty terrible execution on those ideas. A lot of the problems DanMachi has are shared by Wistoria, but Wistoria is different in how much potential they waste with the rival characters of the story. Let's think about a story which has been compared to Wistoria quite a bit. Harry Potter. Now, many people might be quick to say that Harry Potter was never good, and it always sucked. Perhaps we'll have to disagree there, because even though we can talk all day about how terrible the world building, plot, and naming conventions in Harry Potter are, one thing we cannot dismiss is how immersive the world was, and how engaging the characters were, and how popular the series became. Harry Potter was written competently enough to avoid many of the pitfalls Wistoria finds itself getting trapped in. And while popularity is not really a measure of quality, it's also something that we should still take into account. Both of these stories are popular, but for different reasons, and to different degrees. I would argue that Harry Potter is eating Wistoria's lunch. Regardless, I believe that it's a concept and a premise for these stories which gets so many people invested in it. The fantasy of becoming a student at a magical university with spells and mythical beasts is just incredibly compelling. Almost as compelling as the fantasy of having a cool dragon partner to ride into battle. Wistoria, however, falls short in one specific area where I think Harry Potter excels: the antagonists. I've made a video on this before, link on screen or in the description, but the crux of it is that any antagonist or villain for a story must provide a good conflict for your protagonists, or else the story will become boring. In the first episode of Wistoria alone, we can see this flaw on full display. They do a great job of setting up a character that I really want to hate. A dude with fire powers and red hair who is supremely gifted and competent, and who has a bone or 7 to pick with our main character. He's constantly stomping all over the main protagonist's hopes and dreams, trying to put him in his place and take out whatever insecurities he has on our protagonist. This is a fantastic way to make a bully character because it gets me invested in seeing how this character will one day be defeated, only for my disappointment to be immeasurable as I watch the rest of the episode and find our main antagonist pretty much pissing his pants while our cool and underrated main protagonist saves his life from a demon. Here's why it's a bad thing. They blew their load too quickly. All of the setup and threat that this flamey guy had or would have posed to our main protagonist is now completely out of the window. There is no lingering question about who is stronger between the two of them. There is no danger present when the antagonist is on the screen with his lackeys. It's just some insecure loser who's constantly falling behind our main protagonist, who is totally weak but has a super OP ability and is outdoing most of the student body anyways. So whenever they try to downplay the achievements of our main protagonist, we're just left to wonder what this guy's damage is. I mean, our main rival for the protagonist is basically just a loser who can't even compete at all. And maybe it'd be more forgivable if it happened just once. But they do it every damn time. I mean, anytime I find myself getting even a little bit invested in these dickhead antagonists that are introduced in the story, they just end up losing in the most pathetic ways possible. There's always this sense that the main protagonist never had to learn or grow or do anything other than be themselves in order to defeat those antagonists. All the tension created is just instantly released the moment it's built up. And any tension they try to build or any drama they try to keep going is just immediately undercut by the fact that we know the main protagonist is capable of absolutely dog walking them. In fact, he could snap their spines over his knee and they would be able to do nothing about it.
Stop right there, Protag-kun. We're not leaving here until you beat my ass again.
Hey man, I really don't want to have to beat your ass again. Can we just, be friends and work together?
No. You're gonna beat my ass, and you're gonna like it. Look at me. Why aren't you looking at me anymore? Come on, beat my ass again. Please. Do it. Do it now. Stop running away from me and beat my ass.
Oh, but we're in the middle of a tournament and you're on the same team as me. Can't I beat your ass later? I mean, do I really have to beat your ass now?
I'm gonna crash out and burn everything you love if you don't beat my ass right here, right now, publicly, for everyone to see. Beat my ass.
Fine. You've given me no choice but to use 5% of my power to beat your ass for the third time this week. You really are strong after all, Antag-kun. I hated every second of that. In order to fix Wistoria, all I'd do is allow the antagonist to be formidable when it counts. The antagonist should win, and whenever they lose, they should lose in a graceful fashion so that they can keep antagonizing our main character. Not only does that make the story better, but it also makes the protagonist look better having overcome worthy opposition. Sure, we can have redemption arcs for these rival characters as they slowly come to understand that the protagonist they've been bullying all this time is actually not a bad guy, and they've been projecting their own inadequacies upon him in an effort to defend their egos. But let's linger in the drama a little bit more for stories like this. Speaking of lingering in the drama more, I'm going to move on to my third type of story, which I would like to rewrite. This type of story is characterized by how it was fantastic in the beginning, only for a single defining moment somewhere in the latter half of the story to send its quality straight into the gutter. These are the jump the shark and Pandora's box type moments in a story where, without those moments, all of the events following would likely be way different and more enjoyable. Now, this is not to be confused with a story like JJK, where, similarly, I heavily enjoyed the first half until it slowly degraded over time. No, JJK's problem was that the overall outline of the story and the plot is good on paper, but the execution of the latter half is just not. For these stories in particular, though, it's that the outline of the story and the plot is wrong when you look at it in retrospect. For me, these stories are things like Darling in the Franxx, Rising of the Shield Hero, and The Promised Neverland. And before anyone criticizes me for using almost nothing but anime examples in this video, shut up. I like anime. It's the majority of the things that I watch. Those are my tastes because a lot of the live action content coming out these days is just readapted slop from a decade or two ago that wasn't even that good a decade or two ago. If you want, then in the comments section, you can recommend me to take a look at some live action shows that you find interesting. And maybe then I'll make a video on them and their writing. Until then, though, sit back down and listen to me yap about the cartoons from Japan that piss me off sometimes. Thank you. Anyways, let's start it off with some of the stuff that I talked about in other videos. Shield Hero is one of those stories that I initially dropped without really knowing why I dropped it. I think I was waiting for new chapters of the manga to come out at the time, and I just never really picked it back up. It was only after watching the animated seasons beyond the point I had been reading in the manga that I now understand exactly why I dropped it. You see, the only reason I was invested in the story to begin with was the fact that we had a subversion of the typical isekai protagonist trope, wherein someone is summoned to another world and granted a super OP ability or item by the royalty of that world in an effort to save the lands from a dark evil. What Shield Hero did was grant our protagonist one such item, but with a lot of baggage to go along with it. No one in that world respects the Shield Hero, and there are entire religions set up around excluding the Shield Hero because they were too kind to demi-humans back in the day. Because of that, it doesn't matter who our main protagonist is, their name is going to get dragged through the mud and stomped into oblivion, while the other three heroes are constantly getting recognized, rewarded, and even taking credit for the Shield Hero's deeds. That's awesome, by the way. Probably not awesome for Naofumi, our main character, but it's awesome for us, the viewer, to enjoy. I absolutely love characters who still find ways to do the right thing despite how cruel and unfair the world around them is. I like when a protagonist is forced to use their brain to overcome unfair obstacles that they are ill-equipped to handle. I love when there are conflicts generated by misunderstandings and malicious smear campaigns. Most of all, I absolutely hate crybullies, and it's a great way to get me invested in the story by involving a crybully character in a position of power. So once Shield Hero resolved that conflict with said crybully character, I was kind of left in a state of limbo. Once again, we see a story which traded good tension and conflict for a cheap power fantasy. None of the other three heroes in the story are competent. If anything, they're all pathetic. There's no threat from them anymore after a certain arc. And all of the new threats that we're introduced to just feel hollow and boring. God damn, that turtle arc was dog shit. Holy! If I were to rewrite Shield Hero, I would simply do everything I could to maintain the status quo that was established in the beginning of the story, until the very end of the show. Perhaps our main character still steadily grows his power and influence, but I would personally guide the story towards a rebellion. Now Fumi should see that the only way to survive is to work together, but that the king himself works against his people's own best interests. It's up to Naofumi to convince these dumbass heroes to listen, and prove that the only way they're going to survive this and save the world is if they do it together, because even if they have the three of each other, they won't be able to do anything without the fourth. And I would frame these other three heroes not as a group, but more as individuals with their own individual groups and teams. I would turn each of the different heroes into their own individual antagonists and arcs, which the main character must fight through and defeat. Perhaps these antagonists will not change immediately. Some of them might even hold a grudge and use it as an example of why our main protagonist is such a bad person. But this is where I would begin switching POVs to really characterize and flesh out the other heroes of the story. Take the audience through their daily lives and get them to understand all the reasons we hate them, as well as all of the few reasons we might have to like them. Then, slowly but surely, working towards that redemption arc for those characters, resolving any misunderstandings between the protagonist and the antagonist, and forcing those other heroes to introspect, taking small steps towards real progress until, by the end of it, the four of them are working together against the real enemy of the story. And perhaps anyone who isn't willing to work together is corrupted by that dark evil as they try to destroy the world. Who knows? Either way, I think that'd be way more compelling than what we ended up getting. Moving on from that though, if you haven't watched Darling in the Franxx, I highly recommend watching up to episode 15 or so, because that's where the story truly ends. However, for those of you who have watched the rest, you know that Darling in the Franxx jumps the shark and does not look back until we're hurtling through space with a gigantic space bride. The thing I would change about Darling in the Franxx is something that I have suggested in previous videos. It's basically that I would focus on the relationship between Zero Two and Hero, and then use that to build out the rest of the team. Then, I would have this fully functioning and synergistic team of friends fight their rival squad as they work to overthrow the corrupt government that's been slowly killing their planet and exploiting humanity. I'd do away with all of the alien versus Klaxosaur shit, and just allow the Klaxosaurs to serve as nature's punishment for humanity's wrongs. Get our characters to slowly understand that the only way to defeat the Klaxosaurs is to help rebuild the planet one step at a time after they overthrow the corrupt government that's had a stranglehold over humanity for centuries. Also, I would really pull on all of those same emotions that Gurren Lagann managed to capture in its show about rising up and always pushing forward no matter how much others try to limit you. As for The Promised Neverland, this is one of those cases where I don't really know what I'd do, at least not initially. I think many people who have watched the show will point to the second season as the point where everything went to shit. And I definitely agree for the anime, because the manga was actually pretty good after the quote-unquote first part was over. And that's because they had a really cool arc right after the children escaped the plantation, which for whatever reason the anime just didn't include. However, the main problem isn't really the absence of that arc. It's the absence of something else in the story, and that's stakes. You see, in the beginning of Promised Neverland, the stakes were set high, instantly. The children must play a game of cat and mouse to escape their plantation, or they will be eaten alive by the monsters who loom outside of it. We even see one of our main protagonists presumably die, and I say presumably because, yeah, no, that just didn't happen. See, the main issue with Promised Neverland is that it goes back on the promise it makes in the very first chapter of the story. From the very beginning, we're promised this grotesque world of monsters where death and tragedy lurks around every corner. We have a massive cast of characters, all of whom have the potential to be fleshed out and built up, or simply taken from us too soon. The moment in the story that I can point to where everything went to shit was the moment when Emma said no one else was going to die on her watch, and then nobody did. You see, the plot is flawed because no one actually dies. There's no stakes, there's no consequence for anything that they do. Emma said nobody would die, and therefore nobody dies. And the more we discover about the actual nature of this world and what's happening in it, and the more we go through the story and see all of the things and events that transpire, the less any of it makes sense, and the more forced it feels when we have a happy ending anyways. If you guys don't know anything about the ending of The Promised Neverland's manga, and you don't mind spoilers, I highly recommend checking out an old video made by Lowart. Lowart? I don't know. Low Art? That guy. It pretty much compiles all of my own personal grievances with the manga into a nice and focused package. To move on with the exercise of this video though, the thing I would do to fix The Promised Neverland is actually pretty simple. I would kill the fuck out of them kids. And yeah, that sounds cruel and insane, but it's also pretty much what we were promised from the beginning of the story. If anything, I would introduce more of a time skip in the story after the plantation arc, where we get to see a fully grown Emma and co working actively to rebel against these monsters. I would focus the plot a lot more around the revolution aspects of Emma and the gang fighting back against this oppressive system of human cattle. As our protagonists go into each plantation, they should rescue some new characters from their fate, all the while occasionally losing an important character in the process. I would make sure to maintain that it's a cold and brutal world out there, filled with unrealized potential and premature death. one where Emma should be forced to come to grips with the fact that she cannot save everyone, and she cannot have a happy ending for herself. The only thing she can do is make a better world for the people who come after her, and ensure that no one else has to suffer and sacrifice in the same way that she has. By the end of the story, it should be bittersweet, but we should feel at peace knowing that the job is done and that Emma has created a better world, that the worst is over, and that better days await. Now, some of you might not like the direction I took some of the stories in this video. There might even be a few of you who think that the ways I would choose to rewrite these stories would actually make them worse, not better. And I think that's a valid critique to have. The core purpose of this video is not to shit on these stories or act like I'm a better writer than the people who wrote these stories. It's an exercise to put you in a creative mindset. Right now, I want you to think of a show or a series which disappointed you. Think about what you might do differently if you were in charge of writing that story. And now that you have that idea, throw away all of the distinguishing features of that story and repurpose the fundamental principles of that story for your own creative works. Capture the spirit of those other stories and write them in a way which gives you some personal closure. Now, I know that there are a lot of people who will do this, but they won't get rid of the distinguishing features of a show. And it's called fan fiction. When people write fan fiction, a lot of the time it's because that story has heavily inspired them to write something in the same world. Whether it's the fact that the premise itself is so strong that people just immediately want to write about a character that lives in that world, or because they just really like the story itself. Fanfiction is a thing for a reason. A good example I've found of this is the Pokemon fandom. With a series of constant, unending disappointment and subpar writing in the anime, there is a slew of amazing Pokemon fanfiction which completely trumps many of the official stories we are given. There is so much we can do with the concept of Pokemon, and the only thing that's stopping people is Nintendo's retinue of legal ninjas who will cut your throat open at the first sign of copyright infringement. Heck, there are amazing fan games with incredible stories that Nintendo just doesn't like existing. But I use Pokemon as an example because it's one of those things which shows that sometimes a fan fiction can be its own story if we just replace all of the copyrighted material. And sometimes that story can just be better than its inspirations. So when you're trying to think of a new story, think of all the stories in your life which disappointed you at some point. Take the premise, take everything you enjoyed about that story, leave the rest, and fill the void with your own ideas. Who cares if it's a good or bad story in the end? What matters is that you take action in this moment. Open up a document and start writing.